Or is it
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, just started. Okay.
Good afternoon. I did encourage you to please continue to get your lunches. We're going to get started with our introductory remarks so that we can move forward and hear from our panelists.
We might need one attention.
So I'm going to get started. My name's Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director here at the Harvard Law School Library. Welcome to our first book talk of 2019. We're very excited to have everybody here today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Dean's Office for sponsoring our lunch for this event, and the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School for co-sponsoring. So please continue to enjoy your lunch while we proceed. I also want to let you know that today's talk is being recorded. It will be on the law school's YouTube channel sometime next week. I tell you that for two reasons. One, so that you can watch it again, but also so that you know that our Q&A period is also being recorded. Today's moderator is Elena Fagotto, who's a co-investigator of the Project on Transparency and Technology for Better Health and former Director of Research Transparency Policy Project, Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She's been affiliated with the project since its inception, and her research focuses on information disclosure, regulatory policy, and transnational regulatory regimes. She's analyzed dozens of U.S. and international transparency policies and has published extensively on the role of information disclosure as a regulatory tool and on institutional designs to make transparency more effectively. She will be our moderator today. She'll be introducing the remainder of our speakers. I also want to let you know that today's book is for sale outside of the room, and I'm going to turn it over to Elena. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for this introduction. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the launch of this important volume titled Transparency in Health and Healthcare in the United States. It's an edited volume edited by Holly Fernandez Lynch, Glenn Cohen, Carmel Shachar, and Barbara Lynch. First of all, let me tell you that I was extremely happy when I received an invitation to moderate this book launch, because I am a self-defined transparency junkie. I've studied transparency policies for many years, anything from transparency to improve our diets to transparency to help us choose safer cars or to reduce workplace injuries. And I can tell you that there is no area where transparency has exploded as the health and healthcare field. So this is a great field to look at the evolution and the use of transparency as a regulatory tool. So it seems that transparency in health and healthcare has become the new panacea. So it seems to be the cure-all to empower patients to make better health choices, to let them, for example, when we're sick, the first thing we do is we go online, we turn to Google and enter our symptoms, and it shouldn't be surprising that Google receives about 1 billion health-related searches every day. That's 7% of all daily searches on Google are health-related. We can also go online to look for hospitals where we are less likely to get hospital-acquired infections. We can log on to a patient portal to access our electronic health record. In some cases, we can even look up our clinical notes, and we can communicate with our doctors. So in theory, there should be no better time to be an empowered, informed patient. Some even say that we are experiencing a perfect storm where transparency and digital technologies are going to change health and healthcare, in unprecedented ways. But we have to be cautious, of course, because there are limitations in transparency. Even though the volume of information we can access nowadays has expanded significantly, like never before, before the digital age. When we go online, we'll still struggle to find clear and comparable information on our doctors, right? There are several rating systems, public rating system, nonprofit rating systems offered by medical associations. So it's still hard to make sense of the information that we find. The information is not curated enough for us to use it. And then we have also learned that like in many other public policy fields, the motto, if you build it, they will come, does not always apply. So there are some interesting transparency tools out there, but nobody uses them. So when I read the book, I learned in one of the chapters that New Hampshire has a price comparison website that has been used by only 1% of residents over a period of 3 years, right? So the information is out there, but nobody is really using it. And only about half of patients set up their patient portal accounts, which doesn't even mean that they will regularly use it. So only half even set it up. So one thing that really emerges vividly from this book, and I'm citing what Holly wrote in the book, is that transparency has no on-off switch. So it's not about injecting transparency or not. It's really, it's much more complex than that. It's about what you disclose to whom, how often, and how, right? And before even choosing transparency to address a specific problem, we ought to think how we ought to envision how transparency is going to work, because there are some problems, and that emerges clearly in the book, that cannot really be solved by transparency. That might require more command and control regulation. So transparency has limitations, and this book, I think, asks all the right questions about transparency and advances our understanding of this field in several ways. Well, first of all, this book does the incredible work, it's a titanic work, to put order in an immensely complex field. Because, as I said earlier, there are so many ways in which transparency has been used in health and healthcare. So this book presents a really broad spectrum of initiatives and should be really applauded for that. So from the notion of consumerization of healthcare. So is it good to treat patients as consumers? Is transparency going to change the fiduciary relationship between patients and their doctors? And then there's also a very interesting chapter on HIPAA, right? And how transparency and privacy, this might seem counterintuitive, but they're actually extremely connected, right? Because after all, you're only transparent with your doctor because you know that your privacy will be protected, right? The book goes on to discuss informed consent, sunshine laws to expose potential conflicts of interest between doctors and pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies that make gifts and give contracts to doctors. There are several chapters discussing transparency and economics. In other terms, how transparency could help curb healthcare costs. So Ameet has an excellent chapter on how transparency, so exposing the cost of research and development in drugs, could help reduce the cost of prescription medications. There are a couple of chapters about transparency in the drug approval process in the US and in the EU, transparency for patient safety, transparency in IRB protocols, even transparency in electronic health records, and how vendors of such records actually use gag clauses in their contracts to actually limit transparency. So the list of transparency initiatives is long, and what I cited does not even do justice to this book, which has as many as 23 different chapters on transparency. So you know, it's so rich, it's overwhelming, and so, and another reason why I really like this book is that it takes a really pragmatic look at transparency and looks at it through a critical lens. So the book discusses the trade-offs of transparency, right? And discusses some of the political economy of transparency and the choices that go between disclosing some information and keeping other information from the public. It also explores the distributive effects of transparency because, you know, an important question to ask is whether injecting more information is going to help those who have the tools to understand the information, to look for the information, and to use it for their health choices, or rather will exacerbate health inequalities. And this is a very legitimate question with 80 million Americans having limited health literacy. And then there is also a vibrant debate that is captured in the book about whether transparency just creates noise, right, and obfuscates rather than clarify our choices with too much information. So, and another reason I think why this book is so important is, and I'm citing from the book, because it does not offer an unqualified embrace of transparency. So the experts who wrote this book are actually skeptical about transparency and lead us to ask ourselves important questions. For example, with our insurance coverage and hospitals and doctors that are within our network or outside our network, does it even make sense to talk about choice in healthcare, right? So does transparency without real choice mean anything to patients? And also, the book exposes some complexities of the healthcare system that may not be solved by more transparency. For example, there is a plethora of intermediaries and middlemen. I learned about pharmacy benefits managers reading a chapter, and the role that they play in pricing the medications that we buy as patients. And there are also some aggressive marketing practices. So, is transparency the solution, or should we opt for stronger regulation? And the same goes for surprise medical bills, right? Should we be thinking about ways to force health insurance to absorb the cost of these bills rather than just informing patients about this possibility? So I would like to conclude by saying that this book is very important and timely for those of us who want to become more informed healthcare users. And also it's important because it tempers the enthusiasm for transparency. So thank you for putting together this excellent volume. And I think I should stop here to allow for time for a Q&A. And I will introduce briefly today's panelists. So I'll start with Glenn Cohen. He doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll do it anyhow. So Glenn is the James Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and current faculty director at Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. Glenn is an extremely prolific scholar with over 100 articles and book chapters, and a leading expert in health law and bioethics in the US and internationally. Holly Fernandez Lynch is the John Russell Dixon, MD, Presidential Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. She's also Assistant Faculty Director of Online Education in the department, helping to lead Penn's first online master's degree in healthcare innovation. And she's also a leading expert on the ethics and regulation of research with human subjects and patient-centered research. Ameet Sarpatwari is an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, an associate epidemiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and assistant director of the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, whose acronym is PORTAL, within the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. Ameet is trained as an epidemiologist and a lawyer, and his research focuses on the effects of laws and regulations on therapeutic development. So after this introduction, I would like to start the discussion by asking Glenn and Holly in their role as editors to reflect on this volume and your choice of transparency in health and healthcare, and what you hope to contribute with this volume. And then I would like Ameet and maybe Holly to reflect specifically, just to give you a sense of the diversity of topics that are covered in this volume, to reflect on their chapters. So Holly has a chapter on IRB, and Ameet has a chapter on transparency for drug development. So if you could reflect briefly on those.
Great, I'll start. So every year we try to figure out what our conference should be. We have this open call for submissions, and it's quite competitive. I think we typically get 150 submissions for 23 slots or 20 slots or something like that. We try to pick what we think the hot topic is, and so in subsequent years we've got a book coming out on disability, a book coming out on consumer genetic testing. The new one will be on devices and the management of medical devices. What inspired this one? Speaking for myself, you'll see, and I think we've seen this even more so into the Trump years, a focus on consumer-driven healthcare, and this idea that, the real problem with healthcare is lack of information, problems of action and stuff like that. And if we only were more like consumers in our healthcare needs, we'd all be happy. Kind of ironic now when you look at the tenor of the Democratic debates. And one of the key engines for this is transparency, because the idea is, well, as long as people are informed, we can hold them responsible for the choices they're making, ... So I think it's quite interesting because the classical work on healthcare shows that it's, just beset with informational asymmetries. That is one of the key differences of healthcare versus other kinds of goods. And yes, it is true that transparency can, in some instances, cure those asymmetries, but I think we wanted to both honor the places where that is true, but also document the number of places where consumer-driven healthcare and transparency turn out to be used opportunistically. I think a lot of opportunistic privacy as well. That the idea is, well, now that you know and can make good decisions, A, the fact that you don't make these decisions, you're going to be responsible for it, and B, let's ignore the other constraints on choice that you face, like not having X in your space. And also, I think quite interestingly, and this is documented in a number of the chapters, including Liz's chapter on, Separa's chapter on conscientious objection in hospital systems, the idea that we can avoid other kinds of regulation by curing with transparency. And that's a very easy sell politically. Don't go deep, right? Don't limit or change people's compensation structures or the like, or the pharmaceutical payments. Just have a sunshine law that exposes it, because we've all heard that sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? A famous phrase by a jurist. So I think we both wanted to document places where this is true, but also the myriad of places where it isn't, as kind of a little bit of a prophylactic against movements towards consumer-directed healthcare. Or at least that's what I was thinking. What were you thinking?
So I should also say that I used to be the executive director of the Petrie-Flom Center. So Glenn and I were working closely together in developing the idea for this book back in 2016 when we were deciding what our annual conference would be in 2017. So I have a very specific anecdote that stands out in my mind for how transparency came up in our conversation, which is that Petrie-Flom's administrative director, Chrissy Hutchison-Jones, at the time we were trying to pick this topic, had broken her wrist while chasing after her toddler while she was visiting family in Florida. So she's from here, her insurance is here. So it turned out that she had to go to urgent care and get her wrist checked out, and she got this astronomical bill in the mail because she got out of network care, and she somehow was supposed to have in-network care while she was in Florida. And her bill, she showed it to me, was just ridiculous, right? You couldn't possibly understand what she was being charged for in order to begin arguing that you shouldn't have to pay for it. And so we were just kind of kvetching about how frustrating it was that this bill was not transparent. And then we started to think, Glenn and I, more thematically about areas in which transparency has been kind of pitched as this superficial solution, without really thinking deeply about the kinds of trade-offs that might be associated with transparency initiatives. So I shouldn't speak for Glenn, but at least speaking for myself, I'm not advocating reduced transparency, but rather transparency plus other solutions that will help people take advantage of transparency. So we see, examples coming up in the drug pricing debate, or, in reporting physician conflicts of interest, for example. And I think Glenn is exactly right to kind of point out that these can become kind of buyer beware. Look, we've told you everything you need to know, and now it's up to you to do what you will with that information. But if you don't have access to alternatives, for example, in emergency medical situations, or you don't necessarily have comparison points or the wherewithal to understand the information that's been given to you, it doesn't really help make people's decisions be better informed. And then we started to think deeply about many of the trade-offs that are associated with transparency. So Elena had mentioned, privacy being a major concern, the more transparent you get about things. And then this idea of information overload, right? If you just kind of send people to a patient portal or send them off to Google to find information, it's very difficult for them to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of how they should be making their healthcare decisions. And then the last thing I'll note before turning to the chapters, I suppose, is the inordinate amount of sludge that's kind of built into the system of transparency. So you mentioned patient portals as one example. So if I want to get into my patient portal, I have my own patient portal. My 3 children all have their own patient portals. My husband's is somewhere separate. I need to have my phone with me every time I sign in because it has the dual layer security, so they need to text me a code. I've always forgotten my password. Even when I write it down in my password manager, they have to send me the new like, it just is ridiculous for me to get in there and send an email to my provider, right? And there, once you get in, there's all sorts of resources. I can see my health data and all of that, but it just is such a tremendous pain in the neck to get in there. And I don't know if it's intentional or what's going on there, but I think there are lots of ways that we can streamline transparency that would make it more useful to patients and their providers.
Great.
Okay.
Well, I guess, thank you for Petrie-Flom for hosting in the Harvard Law Library. And I'll take a little bit of a different twist on this in terms of transparency. We've been talking about consumer-driven transparency. And I'm sure when it comes to drug prices, everybody knows drug prices are extraordinarily high and increasing. In 2013, the average annual list price of a cancer medication was $87,000. In 2017, it was over $160,000. We have gene therapy now for spinal muscular atrophy that's $2.1 million. And we've got a loaded pipeline of new gene therapies that are soon to hit the market with prices that will probably all be over $1 million. In addition, we have price increases of drugs that have been around for a long time, like insulin. If you take Novolog, the list price has increased 350% between 2001 and 2016. So the consequences of this are about 1/3 of patients have reported in the past year that they have not taken a medication as prescribed due to cost. And from a consumer perspective, there have been transparency pushes in terms of how many, just out of curiosity, have used a site called GoodRx to take a look at prescription costs. I'm seeing a few hands. So there is a good deal of price variation, but there's a lot of complexity. What the list price is doesn't necessarily mean what you're going to pay if you have insurance. But on a more systemic level, there's a question of whether or not transparency can be a benefit for regulators. And that's really what our chapter focuses on. And I wrote this with my colleague Aaron Kesselheim and Jerry Avorn. And what we had is we had a push in 2016, 2017. A lot of states were pushing forward these drug price transparency laws to make manufacturers of select high-priced drugs or drugs that have increased a certain amount in price to provide some sort of justification for what was going on. And that transparency included really principally focused on what the research and development costs for the drug were. So there's a huge debate in our field right now. What does it actually cost to produce a drug? There's some people who say it costs $2.6 billion. There's some people who say it costs $300 million. The truth of the matter is we don't really know. And this is part of the black box that goes into drug pricing. How are drug prices arrived at? And so that was the nature of these transparency laws, to obtain knowledge of how a drug's current price relates to such factors as its development, manufacturing, and marketing costs, which would assist policymakers in determining when a price was reasonable and perhaps pushing back when it's not. Underlying all of this is this notion that what a drug's price should be should not be, or should not only be, a factor of its clinical benefit, but also what the manufacturer actually did to bring this drug to market. We can debate whether or not that's what we want drug prices to be about, but that's the major impetus of these, what I would say, first generation of state transparency laws. Let's actually make manufacturers show us what they did to bring these drugs to market. And what are the possible benefits here? Well, perhaps greater investment in R&D if they know that they're going to have to reveal their research and development costs. Perhaps knowing what they're doing will help us tailor and promote innovation. And maybe if we actually knew what a fair price was, this could help us calculate what a fair price was if we ever went down the path of something like government use of patents. But what are the challenges here? What sunk costs matter? It's fine to go ahead and say that this drug costs $200 million to produce, but we know for every drug that actually makes it to market, 9 others fail. And so those are just, and that's of the drugs that actually enter phase 1 clinical testing. So which are we supposed to allow and account for all of a drug manufacturer's research and development costs? Is a drug for Alzheimer's, do we count a failure for a drug that was developed perhaps for heart disease? What will this information actually yield? Is it going to give leverage for payers to push back? Well, we already handcuff our payers a great deal. Medicaid has to cover every drug that the FDA approves. Medicare has to cover every drug in 6 classes, including cancer drugs. So even with this knowledge, is it going to make a difference in terms of pushing back and saying what a fair price should be? And then, perhaps most importantly from a philosophical perspective, does cost matter? We don't pay for an iPhone based on what its development costs are. We pay based on the value it provides. So should we even care what the cost of development of a drug is? And I'd argue that we can get into this hopefully in Q&A. There are valid reasons for understanding why, and perhaps part of this is it's been a common justification to explain why drug prices are so high. And if we could tackle that with a bit of transparency, that might be helpful, but I would argue that there's other areas in the pharmaceutical market where transparency would lead to more actionable change. And there, what we're really talking about is we have a convenient game of finger pointing going on, and it's been long-standing, which is, well, list prices of drugs are increasing. What is causing that? Well, the drug manufacturers are saying, well, it's true list prices are increasing, but net prices after rebates that we give to pharmaceutical benefits managers aren't increasing as much. And basically what's happening is the middlemen in this system are not passing along the savings. And the pharmacy benefits managers are saying, no, that's simply not true. We pass through the savings. And so conveniently, there is ambiguity as to what's going on, and there's little action. So that's one area in which perhaps transparency could help lead to further reform in terms of actually knowing how much is extracted throughout the pharmaceutical chain supply. We also have cases where we know that drug coupons are frequently being used. What are drug coupons? Well, if you go to the pharmacy and you use a coupon for a brand name drug, you could pay $0 for a copay. But the system as a whole pays a great deal. And there could be effective generics that would cost less, but you out of pocket might pay more. So how frequently are drug companies using these coupons, and what is that doing to overall appropriateness of prescribing on a population health level? These are other areas in which transparency can, again, yield to actionable reform. And so what a real question we have to ask is, what is worth it for this expenditure of political capital? Over 80% of Americans now think that the government needs to do something to intervene to control drug prices. Now, what that action that will actually yield meaningful benefits to patients is important to consider. But each time that a state passes this law, it takes a huge uphill slog to get that bill passed. And how we're using transparency, it is a question which goes back to the beginning of the conversation, which is it being used as a delaying tactic in the sense that it's a convenient vehicle to show that you're doing something without really doing something?
Thank you, Ameet. Holly, would you like to reflect briefly on your chapter on IRB?
Yeah, I can be very brief.
And then we can open it up for Q&A.
So most of my work focuses on human subjects research regulation, and if you have done any research with human subjects, you know that you need to submit your protocol for pre-approval by your institutional review board. If you're at an academic institution like Harvard, it doesn't even matter who's funding your research, you still have to submit it for approval. And so the IRB stands as a really really critical gatekeeper in terms of what type of research gets done and who is doing it. But we know very little about how they make their decisions. A woman named Laura Stark wrote a book called Behind Closed Doors about IRB decision-making, and she kind of got permission to go and sit through several board meetings to get a sense kind of sociologically how people are interacting with one another. And so in my chapter, I point out how strange it is that these really important decisions are kind of being made behind closed doors. The only people who really know what's happening are the IRB members and the chair and the staff people. The investigators who've submitted their protocols sometimes are invited to the meetings and sometimes are not. They're told what the ultimate decision is about their research, right, whether it's approved or whether they need to make changes to it. But some empirical evidence has suggested that IRBs very rarely give reasons for the changes that they're asking investigators to make. They are often overly conservative in their decisions, potentially concerned with protecting their institutions from liability, or really focused on regulatory compliance, as opposed to thinking more deeply about really important ethical challenges that are not always kind of a one-to-one correspondence with what the regulatory requirements are. And so in my chapter, I basically set out all of the ways in which IRBs are non-transparent and how the system could be improved if they were more transparent. And so that's, I don't remember if the quote came from that chapter or from one of the introductions, but the idea here was not, should IRBs be transparent, yes or no? It was, yes, they ought to be more transparent, but to whom and how and about what? Recognizing that transparency is not free. IRBs are often underfunded within their institutions, and so requiring transparency does require resources, right? To write out opinions and have somebody who's able to respond to questions. So I drew some analogies to legal decision-making, right, where we expect in most instances for judges to issue a written opinion about how they reached their decision, which also helps create a system of precedent. So there's this efficiency benefit to transparency that ideally, even with your own institution, you would have a clear sense of how you had made decisions before. If you were transparent about those decisions more broadly than your own institution, other institutions could start to be informed by those decisions. Investigators could have a sense about how similar cases were decided so that they can decide before they even submit whether this is something worth submitting, or how can I kind of think in advance about how to shape my protocol. And then most interesting and important to my own work was that IRBs, when they're non-transparent, it makes it very difficult to do kind of meta research on them to get a sense about, are their decisions high quality? Are they making the types of decisions that we as potential research participants or beneficiaries of research would agree with? And so those are some of the kind of roads that I travel in the chapter. Totally different than Ameet's chapter.
Okay, so thank you, Glenn, Ameet, and Holly. So I think it's about time to open it up for questions from the audience. If you could please identify yourselves and your affiliation, and keep your questions brief because there's a large number of people here, and make sure they end with a question mark to cite a Harvard Kennedy School dean who used to say that at all events. Thank you. Yeah, and you can line up here if you have a question.
So I will start.
Wait for the microphone.
So I will start in part because I guess that's the prerogative of being a co-editor on this volume, which was a lot of fun. So I'm Carmel Shachar, the executive director of the Petrie-Flom Center. And my question is, one of the biggest stories in health policy right now is about the University of Virginia hospital system that had been very aggressively going after people who owed the money, including employees, including taking really all of their assets. And in some ways, this is a story kind of about the success of information, because action was taken after Kaiser Health News published a big study compiling what UVA was doing. And in a way, it's a story about the lack of success around transparency because it's very clear that the entire community knew what was going on, knew how aggressive UVA was, that UVA leadership knew how aggressive they were, and didn't particularly feel too bad until it started to make front page news. And so I was wondering, in the lens of that story, if you could reflect on when transparency has positive attributes and really does motivate a change or correct an injustice, and when it's just kind of, okay, we all know this, drug prices are expensive, that's not a surprise to us, that our cancer drug costs a lot of money, and doesn't see real action coming out of it.
Maybe I'll start with just to say, there's one chapter in the book directly on this topic, which is Mark Hall's chapter on solving surprise medical billing. I mean, that's some of this, right? What Mark says is that transparency is useful when it's a non-emergency situation. It is understandable to the patient what is being billed for, and the patient has a meaningful opportunity to locate substitute providers. So an interesting question to ask would be, what percentage of care delivered in America meets those three criteria? Emergency, non-emergency, okay, considerable. Could you explain the billing in a way that is not so complex? Well, it turns out it might depend on the kind of number of people involved, as surgery or something like that. But alternative provider that would offer you a different price, that's the place where I think, and Mark is quite clear about this, that I think we'll find the least number of cases where the transparency will help because people have such poor choices. Now, all that said, I am sympathetic to the idea of why a hospital system would want to go after people. Maybe there's a better way of doing this versus not. I think what's interesting here, what this is identifying, is kind of the difficulties of the payment structure in the United States and our view that, you get struck by lightning and then you pay with your house, as opposed to some idea of deeper cross-subsidization and spreading cost across all people. And I think, the trajectory for the Democratic side of the debate has been to increasing cross-subsidization and broadening of the pool, which is what's done elsewhere. But part of it is also what you think health insurance is for. If your view is it's for catastrophes, that's one thing. If your view it's for, the best possible health of the population, then the ways in which you pay for it and the amount you pay are quite different. So I think there's some deep normative choices here.
Yeah, I mean, I think what your question also, I agree with what Glenn said, although I'm less sympathetic about hospital systems going to lawsuits to recover funds. I think what your question points out, though, Carmel, is that there is a threshold of transparency at which it could plausibly make a difference, right? So kind of, in this context, kind of local transparency towards people who maybe didn't have the power to do anything about it, wasn't able to move the ball, but it was this kind of public national shaming that was able to make a difference, right? And so that, again, gets to this issue about how much transparency to whom, by whom, and how.
And I would just add, I think there are different dimensions of that transparency. So as Glenn mentioned, that sort of price transparency on hospital services may not benefit the consumer because of all of the reasons Mark Hall has mentioned. But we definitely have a need for, on a broader level, transparency in terms of journalism and investigative journalism. And I think right now we are in an era, obviously, where that is coming under attack. And the benefits of that are clearly seen in healthcare in terms of surprise medical bills, in terms of pharmaceutical gag orders by your pharmacist not to tell you that you could pay a lower price based on paying cash rather than going through your insurance. There's plenty of instances where the outrage that is generated has actually led to meaningful reform. And so there is a need for local journalism. There is a need for investigative journalism to give voices to people who don't have them. And that's a form of transparency. But what we need to be careful about doing is to rely on transparency as our sole mean of achieving reform. And particularly in the pharmaceutical market, it cuts both ways. The outrage over the pharma bro led to a lot of distraction in terms of what is overall costing the system a great deal of money, and really led brand name manufacturers off the hook in terms of their own price increases and what was going on in terms of what Americans are paying.
I'll just add one more point, which is that the First Amendment is a fickle friend when it comes to healthcare, right? That for every instance where a gag order or compelled speech by an abortion provider is struck down as unconstitutional. There's a case where pharma reps argue that promoting off-label drugs or restricting the promotion of off-label drugs is also unconstitutional, or compelling speech about various databases and the like is unconstitutional. So I think that if you charted all of the cases in the last 20 years involving healthcare and the First Amendment, I'm not sure if you'd be happy from a policy perspective. I think it would come off as kind of a draw. I don't know.
I think that's a good point.
Hi, first of all, congratulations on the book. I'm connecting this to the more global discourse. Next week, there will be a big summit at the UN General Assembly on universal health coverage. And in global health, one of the issues in transparency, which has also been emphasized by ethicists like Norman Daniels, is when you cannot meet all health needs fairly, how can you meet all health needs, how can you meet them fairly? And he emphasizes publicity and transparency in setting the priorities for what will be financed through the healthcare system. And I'm wondering, the United States has been particularly resistant to that systematic, explicit approach, and I'm wondering whether the book addresses that kind of transparency or those issues.
Yeah, I'll start. So there's a chapter by Govind Prasad that I think speaks the closest to this, and that's about trade-offs with scarcity and health fairness and information about the benefits and burdens of health-related products. I think what's interesting to now taking a step back to Norm Daniels, to our great colleague now retired from the Public Health School, whose book Just Health is definitely worth reading and has probably his most sustained defense of this view. I think one of the interesting questions to ask, and I don't mean this to be to slag on the United States, but what deliberative democracy as to healthcare would look like in this country, and whether we think we could achieve kind of his ideals, or if instead publicity about a number of aspects of the healthcare would actually reduce solidarity rather than increase it. So I think about things like disability-adjusted life years and the costs of rare diseases and stuff like that, where I think actually, in some ways, the majoritarian approach would be perhaps in some views produce a much less ethically desirable outcome than one that was truly by majority vote. Now, part of the question is whether you believe that there are right answers here, such that it's possible to say the majoritarian approach results in wrong answers, or whether you think that, in fact, as I think Norm might say, when you get to these unsolved rationing problems, it's very hard for there to be a right answer, and therefore deliberative democracy is a procedural justice solution to a substantive justice question, the best that we've got. But I do think that in general, I would not, like when I look at the reaction to the Oregon Medicaid experiment from so many years ago, and the kind of people got so upset that, heart transplants weren't covered because they were not cost effective. I'm not sure whether that was right or wrong, but I'm very sure the public reaction to that and discourse about that was not the kind of thing that I think Norm envisioned in an ideal world.
And I can, just to build off of that, I think the warning about that is well taken, but I think there is also progress that is being made along those fronts. So one group that I'll highlight is ICER, the Institute for Clinical, there we go. Thank you. Sorry, I always just say ICER. There we go. But in terms of how do you create a transparent process that brings together various stakeholders in the system, so manufacturers, patients, payers, and determine whether or not a drug actually is cost effective, and what values, what metrics will you use. So there has been pushback to the quality. But as a response, ICER has developed a simultaneous metric that will be used alongside the quality. So I'm just saying, in this discourse, there is a lot of potential for discord, but there's also some promise for finding some compromise as well.
Hi, is this working? Yes. I'm Andy Orm. I am a writer in the computer field. I also cover health IT. And I'm interested in the problem of what data is available, because you can't be transparent unless you have the data. I'll give you a very quick example. A friend of mine is trying to figure out the results of treating children who want to transition their gender. And what happens if you give them that and how much it costs if you don't give them that. They can't find the data. So I wonder if you could, the book talks about things like the privacy issues, the cost issues, and when you just don't collect it.
That's great. I'll also say there are things like ERISA, for example, which act as barriers that, 5 letters that only lawyers could possibly love, right? But an incredibly, a benefits and retirement statute that turns out to have all sorts of effects. I mean, I think the biggest gap, and maybe someone from computer science, you'll appreciate this, is that the American Electronic Health Record System is a billing system that has been retrofitted to actually be a repository for big data work and analysis by people. If you cared about getting accurate understanding and information, and Sharona Hoffman's work, including I think her chapter in this book, does a good job of kind of showing this, it's really not great data. It's the best we have, but it's not great data. And then accessing that data raises a number of legal and ethical barriers to privacy that I think my co-panelists might like to address.
Well, let me take this opportunity to talk about clinical trial data sharing, which is not exactly what you asked about, but I think we ought to talk about before this hour closes. And so in that context, there is an increasing push for pharmaceutical companies and academics to share the data that they collect from research subjects, that the primary data, right, not just the summary data. And one of the reasons that there is this push is to allow reproducibility of these studies, and also to allow subsequent product development to kind of start where the precedent left off, instead of having to reinvent the wheel each time. And so it makes sense on the face of it that why should we do all of these studies over again? Why should we ask patients or research participants to put themselves, undertake burden, undertake risk in clinical trials? This should kind of be a common good, even though one company paid for it and did all of the work. And then the companies come in and say, well, actually, this is our proprietary commercial information. Yes, research participants gave of themselves, but they wouldn't have done it if we hadn't brought them all together and analyzed all of that data. And so they then say, well, look, if we have to share our information with all of our competitors, we're just not going to do it anymore, or we're going to do less of it, right? And so you have this really challenging conflict between research participants who in most cases say, yes, share widely, right? I didn't do this for nothing. I didn't do it just for you. I did it to advance science. And companies saying, no, we're going to be, a bit more kind of siloed about this. And you even have this happening within academic institutions, where the way faculty members in science get promoted is to, frankly, closely hoard their data and not share it with their colleagues and, potentially even their collaborators. And so what we need to do is find ways to incentivize sharing. And there are different carrots and sticks, right? So NIH says you must share your data if you want our funding. I think publishers have a role to play here, and FDA has a role to play. There are lots of ways that FDA can incentivize companies to do things that might inhibit their intellectual property, right? So instead of saying you've got patent protection, FDA can come in and say, we'll give you exclusivity after we approve your product if you are a good citizen and kind of share your data with one another. And Ameet may have other ideas about things that FDA can do, but I just want to acknowledge that that is I think, a legitimate conflict, right? That patients have an appropriate argument, companies and researchers have an appropriate argument, and there was a now kind of infamous editorial in which people who wanted to use the data after it had been collected were called data parasites. It was Jeff Drazen, right? So it was the editor of JAMA who
Needham.
Needham, sorry.
No longer the editor, right?
No longer the editor.
Not because of this.
You can scrub that part out of the recording. Who basically, put his name on this editorial saying, look, we did the work to collect this data, and how are you going to kind of compensate the scientists from these data parasites who want to, come in after the fact and use the data that was already collected? And there were kind of robust arguments on both sides about how we ought to go about doing this. But I don't think anybody thinks we ought to let the data go to waste, right? It's really a matter of figuring out how to appropriately incentivize its collection and sharing.
Definitely. And I think on the whole, there's limited time, so there's a lot of stuff I would weigh in on really quickly. But I guess I could just say, to piggyback on that, there are so many stakeholders in each decision about this, and they have vested interests, and trying to just promote transparency without taking into account those vested interests is going to run into a brick wall. And so we need to be very careful about how we reformat the system to promote transparency, and we also need to be really careful to think about recording of this information in a way that's useful has a significant cost. And so you already talked to physicians who say they spend more time interfacing with the computer in a doctor's visit, in a patient's visit, than they do with the actual patient. So if you're going to ask them now to record systematically weight, smoking, everything else in an electronic format, now how are you going to compensate them for an extended visit that's now no longer 15 minutes but 30 minutes? And so the real question is we have to have a frank discussion of trade-offs here. And on the population level, the trade-off is really this question of if you come here with lawyers, usually it's very a risk-averse discussion. The myth of anonymity is popular in the big data concept among legal scholars. Or if you go to data scientists, they really want to share these data sets. They really want to link together outpatient claims with inpatient hospital records. But does that increase the risk of re-identification? It does. But what we need to, so it's not an all or nothing, can we have more transparency and less risk of privacy? It's a question of what level of risk to privacy we are willing to entertain as a society to have this increased transparency, and what benefit that increased transparency actually has.
Okay, we have about 5 or 4 more minutes. Archon, for full disclosure, Archon is one of the directors of the Transparency Policy Projects at Harvard.
So I'm from the Kennedy School, and I've had the pleasure of working with Elena for many years. So I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, but I look forward to doing so. One of the basic dynamics of many transparency systems is naming and shaming and ranking, and then really making people at the bottom of the list feel really bad, and maybe they do a better job afterwards. And you see this in schools and restaurants and insurance, many things. And so I'm wondering whether the volume comes down in one place or another regarding naming and shaming as a dynamic in the health, for hospital outcomes or costs, or whether or not insurers turn down too many claims. You can imagine 1,000 versions of it, and there are pluses and minuses. Where do you guys come from?
I don't think the volume takes a position, but I think that there's some good reason to be skeptical in the healthcare setting, in particular when it comes to outcomes reporting. So the biggest experiments, like in New York and Pennsylvania, on cardiac and stuff like that, what's interesting is that the first order results is that people end up taking fewer, harder cases because they're worried, and it's not clear that that's the effect you want. And in fact, it seems as though to the extent these have had positive effects, what's interesting is that the relevant community ends up being the physician community, not the patient community. There's other research showing that patients in general, even when they are presented directly, forced to look at it, they still tend to prefer word of mouth and the like over these. So I think that if your hope is influencing the patient community, naming and shaming is not that effective. But if it's other communities, there's a little bit more hope.
And I think that's exactly right. Building off, there has been some success in terms of how you define success of using nudging concepts to promote lower prescribing of opioids just based on peer-to-peer comparisons and having that transparency. But the real, I think, problem with this transparency from the physician perspective is a lack of belief that the overall system of transparency will be run fairly. And as long as that belief is there, I think Glenn's point that physicians will take steps to reduce their overall exposure and risk will continue to happen. And so you need buy-in from those stakeholders.
Is there one more question, last question?
Thanks, I'm Carly Zubricki. I'm a Clemenco Fellow here at the law school. I'm wondering if there's any discussion in the book, or if you have particular thoughts on times when there are sort of professional norms that might counsel against transparency that patients might want. For instance, clinician notes that talk about how a patient presented, or other sort of professional dynamics along those lines.
I can weigh in on that quickly. So there's one huge debate going on right now in terms of how much transparency you want for substance use disorders. And 42 CFR Part 2 has very robust patient protections. And there are plenty of people who I very much respect who argue that, in fact, those protections should be strengthened. There are other people who really want to, at a population level, better understand what's going on with the opioid crisis and be able to study interventions, and who say that we just need better transparency because we can, at that population level, do this without better clinical data. And so there is a real tension there, and how do you assure that these people's privacy is going to be protected through greater transparency?
Let me just add one other example. I know we're at time, but after the book was kind of well in its path, in 2018, the EPA came out with a proposed regulation where they said, we are going to advance transparency and we are going to make it so that we will only consider scientific research if its underlying data is made available for other scientists and industry groups to evaluate. And so you look on the face of it and you say, oh, transparency, this seems great, right? But actually, it turns out that in order to look at a lot of the data that was being provided to EPA, it was patient-level identifiable data. And it was going to knock out of contention huge swaths of scientific research that was going to better protect patients from environmental health concerns. And so, it's just an example where on its face, transparency can look great, but in practice can be really problematic. And I looked actually 2 days ago to see what was going on with that rule. It has not been finalized, and the government has to wade through 600,000 comments that they received. So yet to be seen what will happen on. But I think it's a great example of the kind of trade-offs and the way that transparency can be used for good and for more nefarious purposes.
Okay, so it looks like we used our time efficiently. I would like to thank the panelists for writing and editing this excellent volume, and all the audience. And thank you so much for coming. And if you have questions, maybe you can come and ask them. But our meeting is officially over, but we're still here. Thank you.